When you visit this site, you're confronted with the layers of American history that make up its different foundations. From 1759, when the house was built and inhabited by people with a slave-created fortune, to Washington's arrival 16 years later through the era of independence, and Longfellow's recreation of some of those founding moments as a binding cultural mythology for a new nation, right to the eve of the Civil War, where it threatened to come undone again. And I don't think you can see that anywhere better than at this incredible site on Brattle Street.
If you were living in the 1840s, the country was only, 60 years old, and there were many questions on what is actually the future of the United States going to be. Longfellow was essential for creating narratives of what it meant to be part of a country that was emerging from this revolutionary moment, a way that people could make sense of their time.
Longfellow believed that the most American poet was one who combined in him all the traditions of the world. He spoke 9 languages fluently.
He was beloved throughout the world. He was translated into 30-odd plus languages. His impact went beyond the poetry. It permeated music, culture. You saw things like a box of Longfellow cigars. There was Longfellow soap. There were Longfellow playing cards.
He was up to his armpits in letters, thousands and thousands of letters.
He had a kind of position in culture that today we would only think of as major pop musicians. He was essentially the greatest media celebrity of his age.
Longfellow understood from the beginning of his residence there that he was in a historic place.
He was aware that the Vassal family, the original owners of the house, they had kept slaves there.
Being able to actually map out that you are standing on a place where we know that people were enslaved is a powerful testament. The Vassal family were loyalists, which meant that when the Revolutionary War began, the vassals went to Boston to seek protection from the British troops.
April 1775, there were tens of thousands of provincial militiamen ringed around Boston. There were now thousands of British soldiers stuck inside Boston. That was the beginning of the siege of Boston.
George Washington arrived at the Vassal estate and uses it as his headquarters.
The Vassal estate at the time was a large country estate overlooking a river with an enslaved labor force. It probably reminded him of Mount Vernon.
Washington, a believer in American liberty, is himself a man who is made of enslaved people. He comes to Massachusetts as a Virginian, a person who they would have said was from another country, and takes charge of what becomes the first United States institution, the Continental Army.
He was not at all confident about his ability to take on this job, and he had a lot to learn. He had to learn how to organize the army. He had to learn how to work with civilian governments. Eventually, troops from Pennsylvania, from Virginia and Maryland arrived, like him, sort of symbolizing that the entire continent was behind this effort. Washington's Muster General wrote a letter from the House which used the phrase, "the United States of America." That appears to be the first time that phrase was used in writing. Washington eventually, in March 1776, was able to celebrate the first victory of his campaign in the Revolutionary War when the British Army finally left Boston.
around 1826, the immediate wake of the American Revolution. Longfellow starts his career as a writer participating in the ongoing work of defining the nation by words.
Where Longfellow worked, where he composed all of his great poems, had also served as the office of George Washington.
Once, once, within these walls, one whom memory oft recalls, the father of his country, dwelt. Up and down these echoing stairs, heavy with the weight of cares, sounded his majestic tread.
The Longfellow House is a place where some of the greatest poems in American literature were written, and where some of the greatest writers of the 19th century gathered to talk about literature, politics, and ideas.
Fanny Longfellow was part of that circle as well. Longfellow's marriage was a deeply egalitarian one. They would discuss his works, but also works by other writers.
He was very involved in the raising of his children. Being a head of a family was both important to Longfellow and a part of his public image.
A sudden rush from the stairway, a sudden raid from the hall. By 3 doors left unguarded, they enter my castle wall. They climb up into my turret or the arms and back of my chair. If I try to escape, they surround me. They seem to be everywhere.
He was a fireside poet, which is to say, one of the poets that the mother or the father would read aloud to the family in front of the fireplace in the evening.
There wasn't cinema. There wasn't the radio. So the poet was the radio. The poet was the megaphone. The poet was the film.
Until Longfellow wrote about Paul Revere, most people didn't know his story.
Longfellow wasn't creating history. He was creating a myth. He was creating a legend and a story that would inspire Americans.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere.
Listening to the poem, delivering the poem, actually makes history come alive.
So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm.
It's a call to action, essentially. It's a call to renew the promise of America.
A voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore.
Readers forget that Paul Revere's ride is not just about the Revolutionary War. It also prophesies the beginning of the Civil War, in which Paul Revere's spirit is necessary to awaken Americans to preserve the Republic and abolish slavery.
In the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere.
By the time Longfellow writes Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, the nation is on the verge of coming apart.
He used funds from the publication of these poems to fund Black churches, Black newspapers, Black organizations, and helping enslaved people come to the North and seek freedom.
Longfellow was an anti-slavery person, but he was not necessarily a radical abolitionist. Radical abolitionists were people like Charles Sumner, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, people who really believed that African-American people and the formerly enslaved deserved equal rights once slavery ended. Longfellow was definitely sort of ambivalent about that aspect.
He wrote a series of poems on slavery, in which he considers the experience of enslaved people. And there's a poem in particular, I think, that is very striking to me.
These are the bones of slaves. They gleam from the abyss. They cry from yawning waves. We are the witnesses.
It is a great poem of witness. It is an engaged poem, a poem that is a work of advocacy, an important work.
His poems on slavery are part of this long tradition of New England artists and writers who engaged with the time that they were living in, which were these times of uncertainty about the future of the nation.
Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate.
He was crying out for the preservation of the Union, even though he was writing about the building of a ship. And that resonated. When that poem was read to Lincoln during the darkest days of the Civil War, he is said to have been brought to tears. During the darkest hours of the Battle of Britain, Franklin Roosevelt, he wrote that very famous line and sent it to Churchill, which Churchill repeated on the BBC. This is a poem that really transcended. I mean, it was written in 1849. Here it is, 100 years later, still having resonance and an impact and touching people not only in the United States, but throughout the world.
There are phrases from Longfellow's poems that have become part of our language today.
Ships passing in the night, the patter of little feet.
I shot an arrow into the air.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere.
Into each life some rain must fall.
Footprints in the sands of time.
These are phrases that are so ingrained in our language that it's hard to believe that one man came up with them.
Language remembers the poet, even if the people don't.
Dead he is not, but departed, for the artist never dies.
He was nation building through his poems. He sought to speak to the everyday person.
Whether you know it or not, Longfellow has shaped your idea of America. We had a country without its own stories. Longfellow created a series of poems which gave America a set of stories or even myths by which we've really lived ever since.
The story of Longfellow House and George Washington, the Vassal family, means that the country from its birth has these complications within it. That complexity is actually a wonderful way to engage with understanding the past. That's the beauty of having a site like this site.